doing something with the School of Law, the Center for Law, Science, Innovation, is a great delight. And I'd like to thank James Weinstein, Jim Weinstein, for being such a wonderful organizing force and allowing Science Network to come and poach on his party, which is really nice of you, James. I'd also like to thank Simon Blackburn from the University of Cambridge, Faculty of Philosophy, who was one of the organizers. And, of course, as I've been instructed by Lawrence Krauss, I have to thank Lawrence Krauss. So this is most important. ASU's Origins Project, by the way, is sponsoring this event as part of its ongoing research and public programming to explore all aspects of human and cosmic origins. And I expect there will be future events, and we're looking forward enormously to doing some of these things. The format is that the speakers are going to come on and do just a few minutes of throw a little bomb amongst you so that get you thinking in order, and then we'll have an intermission, and then a moderated session afterwards. Some of these topics I think are just hugely important at this point. I'd like to bring the people on shortly, but I also want to alert you that there was, in the 16th of October issue of New Scientist, there was an opinion special. I don't know if any of you saw it. Science Wakes Up to Morality. This is a very timely piece. And it said here, the first paragraph was, morality, we've long thought of moral laws as fixed points of reality, self-evident truths, rooted in divine command, or in some platonic realm of absolute rights and wrongs. But new research is offering an alternative, explaining moral attitudes in the context of evolution, culture, and the neural architecture of our brains. This apparent reduction of morality to a scientific specimen can seem threatening, but it needn't be. Rather, by unmasking our minds as the authors of morality, we may be better able to bend its narrative arc towards a happy end. You're obviously not convinced from your initial show of hands. Let's see if things change during the course of the evening. People are going to come on in reverse order. So let me now invite the panelists on. Please welcome Steven Pinker from Harvard University. Simon Blackburn from Cambridge. Lawrence Krauss, from the director of the Origins Project here at ASU. Peter Singer from Princeton. Patricia Churchton from UCSD. And Sam Harris from Project Reason. So, very briefly, so that we can get into most of these people don't, I mean, they don't need an introduction, but just to remind you that Sam had those wonderful best-selling books, The End of Faith, Letter to Christian Nation. He has a book out right now called The Moral Landscape, so it seemed very fitting that he sets the stage with his PhD in neuroscience as well, since we're talking about whether science can do this job, and get us on the road.
Thank you so much.
Good to see you.
Thank you. Thank you. Well, it's really an honor to be here and an honor to be in this company, needless to say. I'm going to talk to you tonight about the relationship, as I see it, between science and human values. And this is the subject of my current book, The Moral Landscape. Now, many people think this relationship is somehow problematic, usually because they think that the universe is parceled into these separate quantities. On the one hand, we have facts, which obviously science can deal with. But on the other, we have values, which inconveniently for us cover the most important questions in human life, and it's thought science really can't touch these. questions of right and wrong and good and evil, questions about really the core issues of how to raise our children, what proper goals we should strive for in life. And it's thought that while science may be able to help us get what we value, it can never tell us what we ought to value. And I want to kind of push this intuition around because I think this is an illusion. I think the split between facts and values is an illusion. And I think it's quite a dangerous one to be taken in by at this moment in human history because we're in danger of waking up in a world where the only people who are absolutely sure that moral truth exists will be religious demagogues who think the universe is 6,000 years old. And they'll be sure that these truths exist because they got them from a voice in a whirlwind. So I actually think the connection between facts and values is actually quite straightforward and philosophically uninteresting. And for that reason, we could ignore much of what has been said in moral philosophy over the ages. I think values reduce to facts. They reduce to facts about the well-being of conscious creatures. And if you just imagine a universe where there are only rocks, clearly there are no values in this universe. There's nothing that can care about change in the universe. The moment you get conscious minds that can experience change, then we can talk about changes that matter. We can talk about right and wrong and good and evil. We can talk about this because what there is to value are changes in experience, to the degree that experience can change. So if we care more about our fellow primates than we do about insects, as indeed we do, it's because we believe they're laid bare to a wider spectrum of changes in experience. And I think we're right to feel that way. We're right to have our moral intuitions track the possibilities of experience. And if you doubt this, I would just ask you to consider, imagine a universe in which every conscious creature suffers as much as it possibly can for as long as it can. Okay, I call this the worst possible misery for everyone. Okay, the worst possible misery for everyone is bad. Now, if the word bad means anything, it applies to that situation. Now, if you think that the worst possible misery for everyone might not be bad, or it might be good in the end, or there might be something worse, I don't know what you're talking about. And what's more, I'm pretty sure you don't know what you're talking about either. Now, this, it seems to me, is the only philosophical assumption you have to grant me. The worst possible misery for everyone is bad, and everything else, every other possible state of the universe, is better. And given that the experience of conscious minds is a natural phenomenon emerging out of the way the universe is, and is constrained by the laws of nature in some way, then there are going to be right and wrong ways to move along this continuum of possible experience. There are going to be right answers to the question of how to avoid the worst possible misery. And it'll be possible to be wrong in your efforts to avoid the worst possible misery. And that's all we need for a science of morality. Now, some of you may be concerned that this notion of the well-being of conscious creatures is not well defined enough. And I get a lot of mail along these lines. People write me emails saying, well, you're saying that well-being is a value, but you haven't proven that it's a value. And I get emails like, who's to say that if you wanted to torture every conscious being to the point of madness, that's not as good as any other strategy? How could you prove that? Think by analogy of physical health. Okay, physical health as a concept is very loosely defined. It's a truly elastic concept which changes as we make breakthroughs in medicine. When the statue was carved, life expectancy was 25 or 30. It's now 80. If we ever re-engineer our genomes in such a way as to live to be 1,000, our expectations of health would change markedly, and yet we can have a science of medicine without tying down the definition of health. And what you don't get, you don't get pushback, skeptical challenges to the philosophical foundations of medicine. You don't get people saying, well, who are you to say that health has something to do with living a long life free of pain and debilitating illness. You don't get someone saying, well, how would you convince someone with terminal smallpox that he's not as healthy as you are? And yet I get precisely this challenge. And my link between morality and well-being and my description of a possible science of well-being seems open to the challenge, well, how would you convince a member of the Taliban that throwing battery acid in the face of a little girl isn't good? We don't have to convince a member of the Taliban of that. We can't convince a majority of the American population that evolution is a fact, and yet biology thrives. Scientific truth is not predicated on convincing everyone. Now, this is true even of the least value-laden claims about the nature of reality. Think about water. For 150 years, we've known that water is 2 parts hydrogen and 1 part oxygen. What do we do when someone doubts that claim? When someone comes into the room and says, well, that's not how I choose to think about water. Okay. Imagine a biblical chemist who comes in and says, well, chemistry for me is whatever fits the book of Genesis. Okay. Well, all we can do in that case is appeal to scientific values. The most basic scientific fact relies on the value of understanding the universe, the value of respect for evidence. I mean, what evidence could we put forward? If someone doesn't respect evidence, what evidence could we put forward proving that they should? If someone doesn't respect logical consistency, what logical argument can we put forward? And so too with parsimony and intellectual honesty and mathematical elegance in other areas of science. I mean, these are values. Science is in the values business. So the most basic facts about the nature of reality can't be asserted without a tacit appeal to value. So the valuing, avoiding the worst possible misery for everyone doesn't seem like a leap. And clearly there's a continuum of facts that relate most directly to human well-being, about which we can form true or false beliefs. And there's something to be understood about how we can escape a failed state, for instance, as Somalia is and was. This photo is from the 80s. But I mean, think of Congo at this moment, where everyone's daily concern is avoiding being raped and killed by drug-addled soldiers. There's something to be understood about how societies fail, about how people fail to collaborate. And movement on that continuum is non-random toward a place very much like the one in which we're living at the moment. And the requisites of human well-being can clearly be understood on many levels. We're talking about the genome, we're talking about states of the human brain, and we're also talking about economic systems and political arrangements. But each of these levels, granted the details are complex, each falls into one of the familiar bins of science. We're talking about genetics and neurobiology and psychology and sociology and economics. This captures our possible discussion about the real causes of human and animal well-being. And so what I would ask you to consider is a moral landscape where the peaks correspond to the heights of human well-being, to speak of our case, and the valleys correspond to the lowest depths of misery. And one thing to notice is that there may in fact be many peaks on this landscape. There may be many equivalent but dissimilar ways to thrive. But there will be many more ways not to be on a peak. I mean, clearly there can still be right and wrong answers about how to move in this space. And when you admit this, you have to admit that some people are wrong about how we should live in this world, which is to say, some people care about the wrong things. They care about things that reliably lead to needless human misery. And it is not unscientific to say that. In fact, to withhold that judgment from the point of view of science is tantamount to saying we know nothing about human well-being and we will never know anything about it. And that, I think, is, at this moment in history, an intellectually dishonest thing to do. And I think it's actually a failure of compassion, given all of the unnecessary misery in the world. Thank you very much.
Stephen Pinker, Harvard College professor, Johnston Family Professor of Psychology at Harvard University. You know the books. The Stuff of Thought, Language as a Window into the Human Nature is the most recent one. Before that, of course, How the Mind Works, The Blank Slate. And it is, of course, obligatory from all the pieces I've written about Steve to refer to his rock star locks. Stephen Pinker.
Thank you. Thank you, Roger. Can science tell us right from wrong? Yes and no. Yes, in the following sense. I have a feeling, given the makeup of this panel, that given all of the debates that we've been hearing recently about science versus religion, that by science, the organizers of this panel had in mind unreligion. And I would agree that religion cannot tell us right from wrong for various reasons. For example, if we come to religious knowledge via faith, and if faith means believing something without having a good reason, I don't think that people should believe things without having a good reason. If it comes from the glow of subjective certainty, if it comes from scripture, if it comes from authority, those are all terrible reasons to believe something. And I think there's even a more principled argument why religion can't tell us right from wrong, going back more than 2,000 years to an argument from Plato, which I believe is still a knockdown argument today, which runs as follows. Imagine someone said that the source of right and wrong is divine decree. Killing is wrong because God said it's wrong. Well, then you have to ask, why did God say that it was wrong? Did he have a good reason, or was it just a whim? Could he have just as easily said that it's right to go out and kill and rape and torture, in which case it would be right because he said it's right? Now, if you recoil at that suggestion, if you say, no, it would still be wrong even if God said it was right, or if you say God wouldn't have commanded us to kill and rape because he had a reason not to give us that command, well, we can appeal directly to the reason and skip the middleman. Either way, boy, this is I have a feeling this is a non-randomly selected audience. Either way, it's not going to be religion. There's a second way in which science, by any conception, can and has told us right from wrong, because a lot of customs that we recognize today as barbaric, as clearly wrong, emerged out of what we would now consider scientific ignorance. For example, every historic civilization has practiced human sacrifice. Take an innocent person, you subject him to prolonged torture until he's dead. Why would so many cultures do this apparently bizarre thing that offers them no benefit? Well, all of the ancient civilizations believed in sadistic, bloodthirsty gods. They lived their lives. They saw that it was full of nasty surprises. People died of accidents. People got sick. Children got sick. Crops would fail. What kind of God would visit all of this suffering on humans? Well, the answer would obviously be a sadistic, bloodthirsty God. If God has a minimum daily requirement of human gore, why not be proactive about it? Better him than me. Likewise, the primitive pre-scientific mindset believes that there are no accidents. That if something bad happens, if a ship sinks, if a crop fails, then there must have been a witch that cast a spell that caused it to happen. From that, it doesn't take long to finger someone you don't like as the witch that caused that calamity, and that licenses you to kill the alleged witch. We don't believe in witches anymore. One of the great moral advances, I think on a par with love thy neighbor and do unto others, is the one on the bumper sticker, which I'll paraphrase as stuff happens. Slavery used to be justified by the empirical hypothesis that Africans were innately inferior and subservient and helpless. We know from a scientific mindset that that is incorrect, and that undermines one of the justifications for slavery. Likewise, sadistic blood sports, lowering a cat into a fire to watch it burn to death as a form of public entertainment. We have every reason to believe that cats suffer as much as humans do, among them being that we know what makes humans suffer, namely the activity of our brain. We know that cats have brains with all the same parts, therefore we have every reason to believe that cats suffer. As Voltaire famously said, those who can make you believe absurdities can make you commit atrocities. On the other hand, and here's where the no comes about. Let's say that everyone agrees on the facts, that, for example, other people suffer, that cats suffer, and so on, but someone were to say, well, gruesome sadistic spectacles like burning a cat to death are okay because why should I care about a cat suffering? It gives me pleasure. Or it's fine to break criminals on the wheel, which is to say strap them to a wagon wheel, smash their arms and legs with a sledgehammer, hoist them on the wheel, let them die in agony, because bad people deserve to suffer. What else is going to deter people from a life of crime? And besides, it's great entertainment to bring the whole family out and watch the victim writhe and scream, which is how criminal punishment was administered in medieval Europe for hundreds of years. Now, we realize today that that is wrong. And, but on the other hand, it isn't exactly science that tells us that it's wrong, nor is it a gut feeling. In fact, cruel punishments were eliminated not by appeal to religious scripture, since scripture indeed mandates all kinds of cruel punishments like stoning for what we today recognize are trivial infractions like blasphemy and heresy and working on the Sabbath. So that wasn't where it came from. It didn't really come from science because there wasn't necessarily any disagreement over the facts, but it did come from reason. People provided reasons at the time why cruel punishments were a bad idea. For example, one reason is that each of us objects to our own suffering. If suffering is bad for me, how can I say that suffering is okay for someone else just because they're them and I'm me? It's like saying that the point that I'm standing on is a special place in the universe because I happen to be standing on it at this very moment. Well, if suffering is for everyone is a bad thing, if it's bad for you, you can't coherently maintain that only my suffering counts, then the only reason that you should administer suffering in a system of criminal justice is to deter a greater amount of suffering that the criminal would perpetrate if he was undeterred. Well, if deterrence is the goal of a criminal justice system, you should only administer that much discomfort that would deter someone, and surely locking someone up or fining him would have the same deterrent effect as smashing his arms and legs and leaving him to die in agony. Moreover, if you had a criminal justice system like every European country had until the Enlightenment, where what we would recognize as minor crimes like gossiping was punishable by hideous torture or shoplifting, well, that creates a perverse incentive structure. Because if someone wants to shoplift a loaf of bread and they know that they're going to be tortured to death, well, they may as well kill the shopkeeper while they're at it, because there could be nothing worse than the punishment they get for stealing the loaf of bread. Why not reduce the probability of getting caught by committing the maximum possible crime? And so that is a good reason to calibrate punishment in a criminal justice system so that the worse the crime is, the more severe the punishment is. Now, these were arguments. They're not religious arguments. They're not scientific arguments. They were offered by people like Cesare Beccaria, a philosopher and an economist. And that is the kind of reasoning that we use in conjunction with a better understanding of the world to tell us right from wrong, both in history and today. This kind of secular reasoning is done not just by scientists, but with the help of historians, journalists, essayists, polemicists, legal scholars, and moral philosophers. Now, one could say, since it's really hard to find a sharp dividing line between science and many aspects of philosophy, or science and social science and history, history and political science. One could just say that anyone who engages in secular reason is a kind of honorary scientist that will define science in the broadest term of relying on logic and evidence rather than on dogma or authority or subjective feeling. If that was the definition of science, then I would say yes, science can determine what's right from wrong. It's not the way most people use the word science, and as long as what people think of when they think of science is biology and chemistry and physics, I would say that science is indispensable in determining right and wrong, but it's not enough to determine right and wrong.
So two quick things before we go to intermission. Please remember, if you want to actually ask a question for the session, to write the thing down and give it to whoever's standing over there. I can't quite see who it is. And secondly, having moved along a little bit now, let me ask you again the question I asked you when you came in, when we first started. Just that broad thing. Can science tell us right from wrong? Who said yes? And who says no? Beginning to sound like a cracked record here, but also in that issue is a piece by Peter Singer, who is Professor of Bioethics at the
University Centre for Human Values.
Yeah, but you've got this. There's a second place. You also have an Australian place.
I'm also at the University of Melbourne at the Centre for Applied Philosophy and Public Ethics.
And the books, of course, range from the wonderful, life-changing book Animal Liberation some time ago to the latest one, which is called The Life You Can Save. And on the back it says Peter Singer has been called the most influential living philosopher by the New Yorker, and named one of the 100 most influential people in the world by Time magazine. So I'm sorry, but you have to go and live that down. So.
Thank you very much. I appreciate the invitation to be here, and it's thank you whoever turned the lights up a little bit, so it's really much nicer to see who you're speaking to. Sorry for the other speakers who didn't get that. We are having a debate about whether science can tell us right from wrong. It's an old debate. In fact, if we go back to the publication of Charles Darwin's classic, The Origin of Species, one of the first reviews said that if Mr. Darwin is right about the theory of evolution, he's proved that might is right. Well, of course, Darwin, receiving that review, said this is nonsense. He had claimed to have proved no such thing. He was very wise in saying that what he was doing was a matter of science, not a matter of ethics, although that doesn't mean that it didn't tell us some important things about ethics, and I'll come to that in a moment. But that example has gone on many occasions. In the 1970s, E.O. Wilson, Harvard University, published a book called Sociobiology, the New Synthesis, which applied what we now call evolutionary psychology to human beings, very controversial, provocative thing to do, and again told us a lot about the evolutionary significance of social behavior. But in the last chapter of that book, he applied that to human beings, which is fine, I think absolutely right, of course, that we are animals, we are evolved, and our social behavior is also something that has evolved. But he made some claims about morality that were a little reminiscent of what Sam Harris said earlier. He said that the day will come when we have so understood the hypothalamic limbic systems that we can find the premises of morality and deduce a knowledge of right and wrong from that understanding. Now, I think that was a mistake to believe that any kind of scientific knowledge of that sort would actually provide us with moral premises. And I put the emphasis on the word premises because science certainly does provide us with information that is extremely important for us in working out what is right and what is wrong. But I don't believe that it can provide us with the premises, with the basic values that we have to work from. And I think that's important. Let me just go back a little bit before I explain that. So, well, what does science tell us about the origins of morality, what morality is? Because, of course, that's really what Darwin, to some extent, not so much in The Origin of Species, but in The Descent of Man and in other works, and also E.O. Wilson, were trying to say, we've now understood morality. Science has given us an explanation of where morality comes from. And I think that's true to a significant extent, that we understand, for instance, that morality evolved, that it evolved in other social animals, in particular in the social mammals, and that it's a mistake to think of morality as something that is only observable in human beings. As we get to animals that are more like us, that not only are social mammals but have good memories, have recognition of each other, live in small groups where they recognize each other, we see behavior that is much closer to our own in terms of following moral rules. So, for example, we see ideas of reciprocity in chimpanzees. Frans de Waal, who's observed chimpanzees for much of his life, tells stories where he observes that if one chimpanzee does a favour to another, and then similar circumstances arise, but the positions are reversed, and the other chimpanzee, the one that was done the favour, does not reciprocate, the chimpanzee who was expecting the other one to reciprocate gets angry, may attack the one that failed to reciprocate. So a basic idea of justice that we have, that is, that if you do a favour for me, I should do one for you, that idea of reciprocity is present in non-human animals. So we understand that as something that has evolved, along with a number of other things, including, of course, that caring behaviour for our kin. But we are also beings who have evolved capacities to reason that go beyond those of chimpanzees, and capacity to use language that goes beyond those of any other species that we're aware of. And that means that we start to think about our behaviour in ways that I don't believe any other species that we know of, on this planet anyway, does think and reflect about our behaviour. And because of that, although science can tell us where morality has come from, that doesn't tell us what we ought to do. In fact, sometimes it actually tells us that the instinctive behaviour that is evolved might not be the best kind of behaviour for us to have in the particular circumstances in which we live. So, for example, we've evolved the idea of caring for those close to us, our kin and those we love and those we grew up with. We don't have the same response to caring about those far away who we don't see. And that's a serious problem in the world, because we may know at an intellectual level that there are people who need our assistance elsewhere in the world who are living in great poverty. And while I agree with Pat Churchland that not all aid always is effective and does what we want it to do, we can learn from mistakes, and we certainly can, and I believe we ought to help people far away, even if we don't have the evolved response that leads us to care for them in the way we care for people close to us. So I think we make mistakes in that way, in that we donate. Americans generally are quite charitable. We give quite a high percentage of what we earn by world standards, roughly 2%, to charity. But I think a lot of it is far less effective than it could be because we give it to other Americans. And we're one of the wealthiest countries in the world. And even if you are poor, and we do of course have poor in America, if you are poor, let's say you're earning less than $20,000 a year for a family of 4, puts you below the poverty line, it takes tens of thousands of dollars to make a difference to how well off you are. Whereas we know that in the world over 1 billion people are living on less than $1.25 US per day, so we're talking about $500 a year, and we know that we can make a huge difference to their lives and, for example, save the lives of children who are currently dying at a rate of something like 9 million children a year die, children under 5 die every year from avoidable poverty-related diseases like measles or diarrhea or pneumonia. And yet we don't give more than a tiny fraction of the money we give to charity to the people who need it most and where our dollars could be most effective. And that, I think, is a moral failing, but one that is explicable in evolutionary terms, but not one that we want to follow. We want to understand our behaviour and try to change it for the better, rather than simply say, well, morality is something that's evolved and somehow, therefore, we're stuck with it. So that's an example of the need to reflect and think. Now, so far you might say, well, that's exactly what Sam Harris was saying, really, wasn't it? That we should be concerned about the well-being of everyone, and not only humans, but non-human animals as well. If they can suffer, if they can enjoy their lives, that's important too, and we ought to be concerned about that as well, and I certainly think that that's true too. Isn't that what Sam Harris was saying? Well, yes, he was, and I agree with him to a very large extent in terms of what we ought to do, in terms of the substance of how we ought to live. I agree we ought to be concerned to improve the welfare of every being that is conscious, that has a welfare, whose life can go well or badly. But I don't agree that science can tell us right from wrong. I don't really think that science tells us that. I think it's a big story, but I think we can see that there are reasons that the fact that a being is suffering gives us a reason to do something about that suffering, not something that science itself tells us. But more importantly, I think there's a lot of other questions that are ethical questions that science also doesn't really tell us about. For instance, Sam Harris mentioned the possibility that we might discover things about changing our genome so that we can live for 1,000 years. Suppose that we do discover that, but we still live on a world with finite resources that can't give a good life to more than, let's just say, 10 billion people. And let's say that by the time we've discovered this, there are 10 billion people on the planet. And let's say that although we've discovered how we can live for 1,000 years, the quality of our life starts to drop off after the first 100 and just isn't as good for the remaining 900 as it was for the first 100. Not implausible. Then there's an ethical question. Should we extend life for 1,000 years? Because don't forget, we can only have 10 billion people on the planet. And if each of them live for 1,000 years, obviously fewer can exist. Whereas if we voluntarily said, no, this is not a scientific development we want, then we could have more people coming into existence living that great first 100 years and then dying after 100 years. I don't see how science can tell us whether it's better to have, over time, more people alive who will live a very high-quality life for 100 years, or fewer people who will live a less good life, but still a good life, but just less high-quality life, for 1,000 years. I think that that's a question that we have to reflect on, and if there is an answer, we have to find it. And that's not, although that's a science fiction example, there are many other cases that we can think of, and I agree with Pat Churchland that there are things that science doesn't tell us. One of them, again, relates to one of Sam Harris's examples that is a really practical problem. He said, well, medicine has a definition of health, good health. We don't really get doctors to argue about that. But in a way we do. We do have questions about, do we want to extend life for somebody who is, let's say, 80 and developing dementia, and we could extend their life by more years, but should we? Now you might say, well, that depends on what their wishes were. Perhaps it does, perhaps it doesn't. These are things we can disagree about, and they're things we should discuss, and I don't believe they're things in which science can give us the right or wrong answer, although, as I say, in many cases it can give us information which will lead us to better implement the values that we have and on which we agree. Thank you very much.
Next up, Patricia Church. And as I mentioned, this October 16th issue of New Scientist, extremely good. Pat has a piece in here as well, Roots of Right and Wrong. And as it says here, Patricia Churchland is a philosopher of neuroscience at the University of California and the Salk Institute, both in San Diego. Her book, Brain Trust, What Neuroscience Tells Us About Morality, will be published by Princeton University Press in March 2011. Pat.
Great. Thanks very much. Thanks. It's a great pleasure in particular to speak after Sam Harris, because some of what I want to say really falls within the general structure that I think he has laid out. So the question that I'm interested in is where values come from. How is it that we have certain values that we live by, so that we cooperate with certain people, we help certain people, we share, we work together, we value certain things over certain other kinds of things. What I have found useful to do in approaching this question is to look at the brain of humans, but also the brain of mammals in general, and to look at the brain within the context of the evolution of the brain, with a view to possibly understanding something about where values come from and how it is that we care about certain kinds of things. All animals, all vertebrates, insects, snakes, frogs, are organized to see to their own survival, to see to their homeostasis, that is, to ensure that their body is the right temperature, that they have the appropriate levels of glucose, that they have water, and they're also organized to avoid certain kinds of threats and to approach things that they need. Priorities are set within the nervous system so that when there is a conflict between goals, the one with the greater priority takes precedence. This is taking care of one's own survival and one's own self-well-being. So the very interesting question for us as humans is, where does caring for others come from? It's not magic. One of the things that we know is that in the evolution of the mammalian brain, many things changed. And in particular because mammals had a different reproductive strategy than, say, fish. They gave birth to live young who were highly dependent on the mother and sometimes on both parents. In order to achieve this, there had to be a reorganization of the circuitry of the brain for caring. And basically what happened is that there was an extension of the, let's just call it, caring circuitry, so that the caring that I used to as a snake use to take care of myself, I now, as a rat or a vole, used to embrace others, in particular the dependent offspring. And so this very major step from self-caring to other caring was achieved early in mammalian evolution. As mammals evolved and other species came into being, Their particular way of life and their particular social niche gave rise to certain other kinds of changes. And we can begin to document, in the context of neurochemicals such as oxytocin and vasopressin and the supporting team of serotonin and dopamine and the endogenous opiates, how it is that these changes actually come about. Now, this does seem to me to be the fundamental source of human values. It comes out of the need to care for those who are our offsprings, our mates, kin, and in some cases, of course, it expands greatly to include friends in the group and those beyond the group. The particular form that values take may vary, of course, as a function of the ecological conditions and the history of a particular group, whether they were ruled by someone benevolent or someone nasty. It may vary as a function of many other kinds of things. And so we can see infanticide being quite common amongst the Inuit in the 18th century, but very uncommon in certain other groups who lived in much more prosperous and easy kinds of conditions. So these seem to me to be the fundamental source of values. And in humans, because we are prodigious learners, and we begin learning social things right from the get-go, then our sociality becomes part of our intuitions about what is right and what is wrong, and what is acceptable and what is not, when it's good to help and when it's not. Now, having said all this, because this was advertised as a debate, I felt it incumbent upon myself to say at least some things of a kind of limiting sort. One of the things I should say, at least in part because of the law school's involvement in this project, is that despite advertisements to the contrary, neuroscience has not shown that no one is responsible for what they do, or that no one ought to be held responsible for what they do. We're a long, long way from showing anything like that. So that's thing number one. Now, one of the things that I think Sam Harris asks us to believe, or asks us to envisage as a consequence of the way he sees things, is that if you factor out false beliefs about the facts of the matter, then the evaluative facts about what is conducive to one's well-being or to the well-being of the group should be evident, and we should get agreement. Now, of course, sometimes people are stubborn and there are temperamental differences, so we don't always get agreement. But even if we are temperamentally, as it were, on the same playing field, sometimes there are going to be differences. There are going to be differences, I suspect, in such issues as assisted suicide. And here's one that kind of troubles me. I think that there may be just fundamental differences in views about the value of shooting someone who is a non-combatant but who volunteers to be a human shield. Now, this has, of course, been a matter of considerable debate as a result of the hostile interactions between Palestinians and Israelis. It's not clear to me that there are any additional facts of the matter that we could bring to bear to solve that particular problem. I think there are going to continue to be really difficult issues about when a war is a just war, when it's acceptable to have a preemptive strike. From an entirely different direction, I think there are really difficult issues where it may be that we don't disagree about the facts, but we disagree about the values regarding such things as mainstreaming seriously handicapped children. Where I do, I think, agree with Sam is that there are cases at the nether ends of the spectrum where it's very obvious that something really is not conducive to anyone's well-being, and on the other side, things that are. Nurturing children is obviously on the good side, abusing children is not. inventing Braille so that the blind can read is obviously on the good side. But I want to suggest that there are a lot that are in the middle, and I don't really know the status of these. I don't know whether it's that we don't know enough factually so that we can predict what the consequences will be, or whether some of these things actually turn out to be fundamental disagreements about value. So I have some here, such as feeding the Biafrans. Now, as many of you will know, it turned out to be a rather disastrous intervention in the 1960s to simply send a lot of food aid to the starving Biafrans. Why? Because it prolonged the war. They had seceded from Nigeria, and once things got bad enough, they capitulated, they were reabsorbed, there was no bloodbath. But the starvation as a result of the blockade by the Nigerians persisted much longer than it would have if we had not intervened. So that's a sort of case where it seemed like a good thing at the time, feed the hungry. But it turns out that aid and just giving food to the hungry is not always the best thing. But I think that's the sort of case that Sam can handle very well, because it's the sort of case where he can say, had we more facts, we would have been able to do well. So roughly speaking then, and this I sort of bring up in order to play the devil's advocate, I think there are kind of three worries that I have about the idea that science is ultimately going to answer for us, or we can look to science to get the information on what we ought to do and what we ought to value. And one is that, unfortunately, and some of you will recognize this, there can be arrogance and silliness on the part of academics. There certainly are, I think, possibilities for academics to be very condescending, to say, look, I know what's best for you, sweetie. You should live your life in this fashion and not in that fashion. There is also a tendency amongst academics, partly because they live in a very sheltered, very privileged environment, to get silly. And by that I mean that they can adopt hypotheses about what we ought to do that really, if you're a person who lives in the real workaday world and you're up against it, does not make very much sense. The second thing that I worry greatly about is ideological enthusiasm. And I mean enthusiasm in the good old 17th century sense, where that meant, you know, you sort of have great ideological fervor and go tromping off at the behest of some demagogue or other. We saw this with terrible results, of course, during the Cultural Revolution in China. And thirdly, there is, I think, a worry about do-goodery that takes on the form of intervening in the lives of others when you really should not. We all know, of course, and have encountered people who really wanted to change our lives for a way that they thought was better, or where they thought they had the normative high ground on some principle of rationality or other. And the worry is that we must not take a bad problem and make it worse by sort of interventionist do-goodery when we really ought to be much more cautious. And so with that, I think I've used up my 10 or 15 minutes, and I hope I've said at least something that will be provocative for the others. Thanks.
So, having spent the last 2 days talking about consequentialism and deontology and virtue ethics and eudaimonia and human flourishing and well-being, you probably noticed that we're already running late. And therefore, I'm worried about your well-being. So if you feel moved, if you feel like we're intruding upon your flourishing at this point, just raise your hands and let me know, and I'll move people along a bit faster. This is Lawrence Krauss. Now, Lawrence is the Foundation Professor in the School of Earth and Space Exploration, Department of Physics, but more importantly for me at least, he's the director of the ASU Origins Project at Arizona State University. He's also chair of the board of sponsors of the Bulletin of Atomic Scientists, which is a very important place to be in these dodgy nuclear times. So Lawrence is actually kind of a public intellectual, as well as being the only physicist to receive the highest awards from all three major US professional physics societies. And today, the prolific author is clutching the advanced copy of his new book, Quantum Man, Richard Feynman's Life in Science. This is Lawrence Krauss.
Thank you. Thank you, Roger, for pointing out we were running overtime just before I began to talk. I really appreciate that. I'm going to depart from my tradition in a way. I'm not going to have any pictures. I'm going to have quotes, partly because I'm on the stage with philosophers and I wanted to appear scholarly. So the quote I want to start with is from Jean-Jacques Rousseau, which really encompasses a lot of what we've been talking about in the context of the meeting that we've been having. It's a famous quote, "Man is born free, but he lives forever in chains." And normally, that's interpreted to mean that humans are born, in some sense, with free will, but we have this social contract. We grow up in a society in which we're constrained. I don't happen to think we have free will, by the way, but what I want to discuss is that the chains that we live in are indeed societal, and in fact, this is, in some sense, the heart of the debate that we've been having. Are we born free, or in some sense is our morality determined by our biology and our evolution? Is our morality determined externally by the society in which we live? Those are key questions, but I want to try and take a different tack, which is to argue that we're also constrained by the reality, and that reality is only determinable by science. So I would argue, in fact, that not only can science help us tell right from wrong, it's impossible to tell right from wrong without science. Because science informs us of what the real world is. And until we know that, we can't make valuable, consistent statements about the world. Now, I'm going to make some quotes from a book that was very influential for me by Jacob Bronowski called Science and Human Values in 1956. It's a book that's so important that I actually plan to try and rewrite it after this next book I'm writing now. And Bronowski said that this is one of the quotes I particularly like: "Dream or nightmare, we have to live our experience as it is, and we have to live it awake. We live in a world which is penetrated through and through by science, and which is both whole and real. We cannot turn it into a game simply by taking sides." And then he went on to say, "And this make-believe game might cost us what we value most, the human content of our lives. The world today is made, it is powered by science, and for any man to abdicate an interest in science is to walk with open eyes towards slavery." And the content I want to say is not so much that science necessarily, by determining neurophysiology, can determine what is right or wrong, but the process of science is what has changed our values, what will govern our values, and what should govern our values. So I want to summarize basically my points. Our moral decisions are constrained by our biology and the social contract, both aspects of what I put in the first slide. But we are rational beings, and no consistent moral decision can be made without understanding the consequences of our actions, and science is the way we determine the consequences of our actions. It is the way to determine what is real and what is not. And therefore, it is a necessary prerequisite to having a consistent moral philosophy. And rationality should be the basis of a consistent morality, and there are many times when it isn't. But one of the things we've learned in actually meetings we've had associated with the Origins Project here on human uniqueness and most recently on cultural evolutionary biology is that there is maladaptive behavior. Humans behave irrationally as groups. But what we've learned is that it's usually based on incomplete information about what's happening in the world around them. that with more complete information, the maladaptive behavior will go away. I would also argue that concepts such as virtue, and in fact every perceived innate belief that we have, is meaningless except in the context of our experience and empirical reality, the two aspects that science reveals to us. And finally, by science I don't mean, again, the science deriving and determining how humans behave, but the scientific method of secular empiricism. Those are the two, I relate the two. Basically, secular empiricism, it seems to me, arose out of the scientific method. It's ludicrous to pretend it hasn't affected our values. It has already colored our values. The values we have today are defined because of 400 years of science. We would be loath to define anyone as civilized whose ideas of justice and humanity have not evolved over the past 400 years since science has changed the playing field of the human intellect. Science, I would argue, and I think Simon may disagree, underlies the Enlightenment. And it has done so not because, well, because it works. That's the reason that we are here today. Science works. It's changed the world in an effective way. It's largely meant most people live better than they did 400 years ago. And because of that, our ideas of what is right and wrong are vastly different than they were 400 years ago. I'm sure maybe Steven Pinker will be talking about that to some extent. And when we look out at societies that deny, that we think are backwards, and I'll pick one as fundamentalist Islam. We look at people who have denied the reality of the world around them. They have turned their backs on science, and we view them as uncivilized, and they've turned their backs on science, and part of the reason that the problems is because by turning their backs on science, they've departed from the modern world and don't have the benefits of modern technology, which has produced societies with poverty and disorder. Now, what is real? I just learned the other day one of my favorite quotes, which is now one of my favorite quotes, is by one of my favorite authors, Philip K. Dick, a science fiction author. He said, "Reality is that which, when you stop believing in it, is still there." And I think that's really what science tells us, that whether we believe things or not, there's an external reality, and we have to learn to live with that. And Bronowski put it a different way. What is truth? The sanction of experienced fact as a face of truth is a profound subject and the mainspring which has moved our civilization since the Renaissance. The common view remains the classical view, that the concepts of value, justice, honor, dignity, and tolerance have an inwardness which is inaccessible to experience. The root of this error, as he put it in 1956, goes down to the closed logic of the Middle Ages and had been formed into a system by Aquinas. But it did not share the test of truth of modern physics, for there's a gap between the intuitive and the corrected concept. For there, the gap is gaping, as he put it. Science has taught us that the world we think exists is not necessarily the way the world is. And we cannot have a consistent sense of reality without being willing to force our beliefs to conform to the evidence of reality rather than the other way around. In fact, I wore this T-shirt not just because I think it's dashing, but because it was given to me by my best friend, and it says 2 + 2 is 5 for extremely large values of 2. And this is the point. You look at 2 + 2 for 5, we know 2 + 2 isn't 5, but science has taught us, in fact, for large numbers, the world behaves very differently than we think it does. And it's important, if we're going to have a consistent understanding of how we're supposed to behave, we have to understand that the world is different than our intuition necessarily projects. And science has been the only way to learn about that. So the habit of truth, which is what science is all about, is the best description I know of it is Richard Feynman, who I'm very fond of because, of course, he's the subject of my new book. The only way to have real success in science is to describe the evidence very carefully without regard to the way you feel it should be. If you have a theory, you must try and explain what's good about it and what's bad about it equally. In science, you learn a sort of standard, integrity, and honesty. In fact, the ethos of science involves honesty, open-mindedness, creativity, anti-authoritarianism, full disclosure. The basis of what I would suggest is a moral society. Now, we had a session on Science Friday, much of this group, and Ira Flato asked, but how can you convince people when they have strongly held beliefs? And I think, I don't know if I use this quote, but it's one of my favorite quotes. If the only tool you have is a hammer, everything begins to look like a nail. I'm an educator, but I happen to believe from a great deal of political experience that when you actually provide better information, people make better decisions. And education is the basis of a more consistent and just moral society. So, good, I got applause. So, let me give you in the last 2 slides some examples. So the stem cells are a big issue, okay? And they're a big debate. But there are certain facts that if you don't understand them, you cannot make sensible moral decisions. Blastocysts, which are the things people work with, are not fully functioning embryos. They're not going to turn into human beings. The embryos destroyed in stem cell research are going to be destroyed anyway. They're not going to be used for reproduction. They were largely donated for research purposes, they're in storage, and they're just going to be thrown away. And finally, one of the big misconceptions the Catholic Church suffers under is that there's a moment of conception. There is no moment of conception. Having gone to in vitro fertilization clinics, I was amazed to see the incredible number of steps starting from what you would call the fertilization process to a fully functioning embryo, and every single one of them is as important as the one before. There's no moment where you can suddenly define a living being there. It's a continuous process. It's not a moment. And you have to recognize that if you want to ask and make sensible moral decisions about whether you believe stem cell research should be funded. Similarly, Burkas, I thought Sam might talk about it, but he said, and I agree with him, that it seems to me putting a woman in a bag is not a good thing. But I also think you can actually ask scientific questions that are answerable, that can allow you to realize that it may not be a good thing. You can ask the question, are women safer and less subject to sexual violence and intimidation if they're covered that way? I suspect the answer is no. But it's a question you can ask and study. You can ask, is their sense of self-worth improved by going into those societies? You can ask, are they freer to manifest their capabilities as human beings? Those are scientific questions one can ask and answer, and they should inform our morality. So, in conclusion, I would say that the science's habit of self-correction as a part of a continual effort to get a better handle on truth promotes a set of values that is essential for the moral health of a modern democracy. No society, no group of humans can successfully address the challenges associated with promoting peace, happiness, and harmony without learning from experience what these challenges actually are and what the alternatives are for dealing with them. There is no inner innate guidebook to deal with global warming, terrorism, AIDS, or even love or murder, because these challenges arise from a constantly changing world that only empirical investigation using the methods of science can uncover. Thank you.
So next up is Simon Blackburn, who's the Bertrand Russell Professor of Philosophy at the University of Cambridge, one of the organizers of the workshop that we've been having. He also goes to University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill for part of the year, and has written a series of wonderful books, which I've made many of my plane journeys much more interesting. One of the more recent ones is How to Read Hume. He did a Plato's Republic, and also some very clever one-liners, which think, being good, lust, and truth. Simon Blackburn.
Thank you very much. Yes, I was very, very, very pleased to be able to write a book called Lust between a book called Being Good and another one called Truth, because that's not where lust usually comes. Yes, well, you've heard some wonderfully inspirational speeches, and I feel very inadequate following on because I am not really an inspirational speaker, and I don't really wish to preach to you. Of course, much of what has been said I agree with. I agree with Lawrence that it's not a very good idea to go around with your eyes shut or to let your fantasies determine what you think the world is like, as opposed to empirical investigation. I think we can all put our hands up to that. I agree with Peter Singer that we could be more charitable, and I believe that charity is a virtue, and I think we probably should be more charitable. Although I also agree with Pat Churchland that charity is very easily misdirected, and in some cases, such as massive aid charity to Africa, there's a nasty fear that it can do more harm than good, and often does. So it's got to be tempered by an intelligent awareness of the consequences. So all these things I thoroughly agree with. I also agree, of course, that our values can be tempered by science. I think, for example, that our further understanding, for example, of the similarities between the male brain and the female brain will march alongside other cultural causes to assist in the equality of women, and I hope it very much does so. I think measurements of identity of intelligence, identity of skill, identity of other cognitive functions, that would be a scientific measurement, and it could also insist, for example, in breaking down racial barriers and in breaking down gender barriers. So, of course, science can inform our values and should inform our values, and I think we all put our hands up to that. As to whether you need nothing but science, which I think was the message, the first message we heard, I'm afraid I don't agree with Sam about that, and neither do the other three speakers I think we've heard so far. And the reason, I think, is an important reason. It's a philosophical reason. I'll just spend a couple of minutes saying why I think it's so. It seems to me that values, well, let's start one step further back. Virtually all philosophies of mind recognize two different kinds of mental state. There are mental states whose business is to reflect the world as it is, to represent the world, to, in other words, inform you, for example, about the environment in which you are to act. And those go by the name of beliefs. If a belief is sufficiently certain and sufficiently well tested, you might call it knowledge. So there are beliefs about the world, knowledge about the world, and their business is to reflect the world as it is. But then there are mental states like desires or intentions or concerns. Now they have a slightly different, the usual metaphor that philosophers use is direction of fit. They're the things you care about. And their function is to motivate you to get the world to conform to the content of the desire. If you desire to go to the beer and get a fridge, you want to change, to go to the fridge and get a beer. Yes, a Freudian slip, I think. If you desire to go to the fridge and get a beer, your business is that you're set, you're poised, you're disposed to change the world so that, first of all, you become nearer to the fridge than you were, and secondly, you get a beer. That's changing the world, and the function of the desire is to change the world to conform to whatever is the content of the desire. Now, many, many moral philosophers, myself included, put values on the desire side of those mental states. The job of values is to orientate you towards the world, to orientate the way you behave, to, as it were, reflect what you care about and what you desire. It's not just what you desire, it's what you are concerned about in much more important ways. A value is like a desire that you're prepared to make public, that you want coordination on, that you're prepared to insist upon from other people. At its limit, it'll define things that you think you must do, not just things you want to do, and things that other people must do in their relationship to you. So those are values. So it's going to be inevitable that there's a gap between fact and value, because the two mental states, the ones that represent the way of the world and the ones that motivate you to act in the world as you understand it to be, have this different function. So, it's one thing to know the world and what the world is like, it's another thing to care about it in any particular way. Now, Sam said that you could just chuck away all the writings of moral philosophers because science had discovered that ethics is about promoting welfare and avoiding suffering. Well, I don't know which science discovered that. It was certainly a major theme of Aristotle. It was a major theme of the Buddha. It's a major theme of Christianity. It's a major theme, as far as I'm aware, of every moral philosopher that's ever lived. Where the moral philosophers find the going difficulty is in having an adequate conception of human flourishing. So let me give an example, a couple of examples. Some people think that flourishing is just a matter of contented, happy, kind of dreamlike mental states, a bit like after you've taken a spliff or two, or you've got that beer out of the fridge, and another one. This was the target of, for example, Brave New World by Aldous Huxley. He wrote about a world of sort of zombies, happy zombies kept in a kind of dreamlike, contented state by a combination of drugs and lies. Another way you can be happy, you can flourish, is by living in a fool's paradise, by turning your face away from the things that might make you unhappy, or just being ignorant of them. So you could take two people in identical apparent mental states. Each of them believes they're living the American dream, but one of them is in complete illusion. He believes that his wife loves him, his children love him, his job is going well, his colleagues respect him. None of that's true. He's living in a fool's paradise. And according to Aristotle and many moral philosophers following him, that man is not flourishing. Because he's living under an illusion, he is, however happy he may say he is, and however happy he might appear to be by some neurological measure, since it is not a life of achievement and of real truth and attainment to a way of being in the actual world, he is living in a fool's paradise. Again, other people have had conceptions of flourishing which included suppressing desires rather than satisfying them. The Buddha did this, Stoicism does this. The idea is that you can easily become a kind of utility gobbler, a utility monster. You want to gobble up experiences, you want to gobble up goods, you want to buy bigger houses, you want to satisfy more and more and more desires, and that isn't a flourishing way of life, even if you manage to satisfy them. The real life consists in self-mastery and wisdom and understanding that desire satisfaction doesn't necessarily bring the most flourishing kind of life. Now, all those are moral ideas which throw around the conception of well-being and problematize it. Sam thinks we can do without all that you can go to a scientist and say, was Buddha right about flourishing? I don't think you can. I think you have to work out for yourself what you care about in your life and the way you care to live it. And actually the same comes when it's a question of the utility of others. Peter talks about the expanding circle as if reason by itself means that you, as it were, expand from being concerned just for yourself and for your family to being concerned for more and more and more sentient things until eventually you become a servant of the world, giving away all your money to other people and so forth. I don't think reason tells you any such thing. I think it's an excellent thing if you expand your sentiments, and I very much hope, as it were, that we all do become more charitable. But I don't think you're under any obligation to become a servant of the world, and one of the hardest things in ethics is to decide how to prioritize your own well-being and the well-being of your family, well-being of those to whom you owe debts of gratitude, your loyalty to particular groups amongst whom you live, versus a more impersonal duty to those who lie outside that immediate circle. I think prioritizing one over the other is a very hard decision many of us have to make. All of us have to make. Every time you take your children on holiday, you could be saving 3 children in Africa, their death or their eyesight or whatever. And yet people do go on taking their children on holiday. And I'm glad they do. I think they have to. So, prioritizing these things is very hard, it's very difficult, it's not solved just by saying, oh, it would be awful if everybody was miserable and it would be wonderful if everyone was happy. You can't live simply with that as a guide, it's no guide at all. So, I'm afraid ethics is and remains a very difficult subject, and it's a complete illusion to suppose that science will give us all the answers. Thank you very much.
So are we settled in? Good. Thank you. There's a huge number of questions here. I'm trying to boil them down to just a few to start things off. One of them that's the most clear at the beginning, there's several on this line, which basically say, look, you know, if you're asking, can science tell us right from wrong? Why should we trust today's science? Because today's scientific findings are likely mistaken. The scientific theories are reliably overturned, not so with moral convictions. What I believe is virtuous is very nearly the same beliefs as Aristotle. Contemporary science is probabilistic, doesn't tell us. And you get the general thrust of that one. I mean, where's the solidity? Where's the certitude that people seem to want from beliefs? Now, you could say that scientists, of course, are not in the belief business, they're in the doubt business, but what's your... Who wants to...
Huge I hear that a lot, and it's one of the biggest misunderstandings of nature science is that scientific revolutions do away with what was before them. That's precisely not how scientific revolutions work. They always keep what worked before them. Einstein may have overturned Newton in a sense, but Newton's laws of gravity still describe the motion of a baseball, and a baseball hit by a bat by the Arizona Cardinals, maybe if it's a million years from now, the next time they're in the World Series, will still be described by Newton. And so what works continues to work. We learn new things at the forefront, but we don't overturn the science that accurately describes nature. And so it's not as if, you know, the argument is given, well, you know, tomorrow everything's going to be different. Why learn science today? That's not true. Whatever we learn at the forefront of science in the future about the brain or about physics, it's not going to change the things that describe reality well now.
Steve.
I think another myth is that Aristotle got ethics right and we haven't made any progress since then. In fact, it's actually quite astonishing to see how morality has historically changed. This isn't a relativist argument that says that every age has its own morality, but I think one could very well make the argument that there has been progress in morality for the same reason there's been progress in science and mathematics. And in fact, all of them feed off one another. I don't know if Aristotle had a good argument against slavery, but there certainly was a lot of slavery in Aristotle's Greece. It's not so easy until recently to find sustained arguments saying that there's anything wrong with slavery, or with executing homosexuals, or with confining women to the home, or with rape, or with animal cruelty. All of the cruelty to animals, a lot of these arguments are surprisingly recent. They pass into common understanding and common decency. We look at history and we just shake our head wondering how people could do such horrible things. So moral standards do improve, partly in discourse with science.
There are also a number of... Anybody else want to go to that one? Or there were a number of questions that asked about the spectrum here. I mean, are we just talking about human beings when we're talking about morality, or are we talking about... what are we talking about in terms of values and value systems in other animals?
Well, I think I addressed that briefly. I think you can find proto-morality, at least, in non-human animals. You can certainly find behavior that resembles human moral behavior. And I think at least in the great apes, we can find some evidence of reflection, if you like, or something close to that in terms of what's happening. Now, as I said, we develop that immensely because we're able to reflect on it in a quite different way and discuss it among ourselves and build up a tradition and refer back to Aristotle or Confucius or Buddha, whoever it might be. So there's no doubt that we have something that's, you know, very significantly different from non-human animals, but I also think there's a continuity that we shouldn't deny.
Yeah, there's one question actually talking about animals flourishing without science and without social contracts. How on earth did they manage?
I mean, one answer would be that they flourished to a degree. They flourished as a species, but of course their lives were relatively short, and many of them died because, you know, nature is not that great, really.
They die horrible deaths.
Well, that seems to me to be putting it a little bit strongly. I think that there are, amongst social mammals, quite apart from social insects, there certainly are local practices as well as practices that obtain within the group over time and sometimes are transmitted to other groups. But by and large, of course, many social mammals have done extremely well, and as long as there are not great catastrophes, such as volcanoes, they really did do quite well.
What do you mean by doing extremely well? You mean the species survived, but many of them died? I mean, we can talk about each species, but it's very common for 90% of the young to die within a month or two of birth in many species, right? So,
like what species?
Well, I mean, take fish, for example. You know?
Oh, no, I thought we were talking about social mammals.
Well, okay, so, I mean...
But social mammals are under... The great apes are under huge stress.
They are now, but I mean, I thought we were talking about while they had a habitat.
But I think that's the point. Without science, they're under extreme stress because of the fact that we're living in a time of perhaps one of the greatest extinctions in the history of the Earth. And, you know, we should tell the new members of Congress that who don't believe in global warming that, in fact, we're exacerbating that by our behavior, and science is necessary to reveal the fact that human-induced global warming is going to change our environment, and it's going to produce many more extinctions. So to be kind to animals, we have to, in some sense, use the results of science.
Yeah,
well, of course. I mean,
before,
but that's a different issue, and yet again.
Before we get too dewy-eyed, we might remember that it's the burning of hydrocarbons, which was also a scientific discovery and a technological...
Look, that's right. That's exactly right. But it's not up to scientists to determine how to use it. It's up to scientists to explain what the consequences are. That's it.
Well, but I think that's one of the issues that came out in our workshop and also amongst the folks out here with a question like, can science tell us right from wrong? It's being construed as being, is it a replacement value system entire, right? So what you're saying is it can inform decisions, but whether it actually becomes
I ultimately think it is, but I think it is even stronger than that. It is, in some sense, the basis of many of our values, many of our Enlightenment values, and I think that's implicitly what many of us in this room are arguing for, exist because of the results of the scientific method and the Renaissance that resulted from them.
I think that's actually a source of confusion. I totally agree with you, but that we're using science in very different senses in this conversation.
I think you're right.
There's a lot of confusion about certainly what I mean by science. I did not mean for a moment to defend science in the very narrow sense as experimental science, men in white lab coats scanning brains as the only source of morality, and that's really a straw man. I mean science in a much broader sense, the sort that Steve invoked, of secular rationality and honest truth claims based on honest observation and honest and clear reasoning. And we all are citizen scientists in many of our, or honorary scientists in many of our moments. And insofar as we're intellectually honest and trying to have our beliefs about the world and our certainty about those beliefs kind of scale with the evidence. And that is the source of clear thinking about the possibilities of human and animal well-being. The crucial thing I want to argue for is that what do we mean when we say that something can be morally good or evil? And is that a truth claim, or is that just merely manufactured based on cultural invention or something that's been drummed into us by evolution and is just a product of our social emotions and emotions like disgust? There are two very different ideas about how science can lead us to strong truth claims about the nature of good and evil. One, somewhat advocated by Peter here, is that science is limited in describing kind of how we got here. So we have evolutionary science, which tells a story about how we got here, and we can understand what people do and mean in the name of morality in those terms. But it can never make the leap to tell us what we should do. And I think that there's confusion there, because it's one thing to ask, how is it that people come, basically every culture we've ever encountered has come to feel that women are in some sense the property of men. We can tell an evolutionary story about why that's so. We can tell a neurobiological story about what men are doing with their brains when they think that. But we can, in the spirit of science, we can ask a very different question. It's a totally different project, and we can ask, to what degree do people and societies become better? Which is to say, to what degree do they experience greater depths of well-being when they cease to treat women that way? And the answers there, whether or not any of us know them, are answers that fall within our growing scientific understanding of the human mind and all of the ways in which we can see the influences upon it. And again, that is not just laboratory science. That's from genetics to economics. And still, that's a domain of right and wrong answers, and it is not tied to evolution in any narrow sense. We have flown the perch of evolution, and most of what we care about, evolution cannot see and has never seen. Evolution has not designed us to build a stable global civilization, and yet clearly our future happiness is largely predicated on that.
Can I ask you? Can I ask you a question, Sam? Because we've had some discussion during the break, and maybe I did take your view of science too narrowly, in which case I apologize. But you just said you wanted this broader view of science from genetics to economics. Now, I know that if in other cultures, for example, if you think of the German term Wissenschaft, which we often translate as science, it includes philosophy and ethics, any serious study of a phenomenon. So I wondered why, if you would say not just from genetics to economics, but from genetics to philosophy. Absolutely. If that's all counts as science, then perhaps we don't really have a disagreement, because we certainly share the view that not only science, but careful thought and rational reflection is how we're going to advance ethics, not through, for example, religious belief or just taking things on faith.
Yeah, absolutely. I think philosophy, there is no clear border between philosophy and science. What I meant to denigrate in my opening remarks are some of the arguments in philosophy that I think are truly useless, and the conceptual distinctions that I think are leading us to miss the very obvious point that there's a difference between the worst possible misery and the greatest possible happiness, whatever that is, and even if there are multiple forms of it. And those differences are fully constrained by the laws of nature. So there have to be right answers, and the right answers are not predicated on whether we can find them. And we do science in the context of that larger reality, which we may fail to fully discover. In fact, we know we will fail to fully discover it, and yet this includes every possible claim we can make in the moral sphere. And the idea in philosophy currently is that is an incredibly edgy and controversial thesis in moral philosophy and metaethics. And I frankly just don't see how it could be, given that every possible experience is only possible based on the nature of the way the universe is.
Could I just ask about that? It's one thing to know, of course we know when things are going really badly, and I think you start your book with a scenario in which somebody's just been the victim of atrocities and so on, and just life's as bad as possible. We all know when things are going really, really well. But the construction of a scale, or the idea that there's, whether we know it or not, there's a fixed place, a fixed way of valuing things, that doesn't follow, and I'm not sure it's true. I mean, let's just think of a case. Suppose we went on holiday last year to the mountains, we went this year to the seaside. Was one holiday better than the other? Well, I deny that there's a single objective answer to that, which we just don't happen to know, but that some omniscient sort of brain scanner in the sky could measure. Because a lot of it's going to be itself conditioned by value judgments. If my wife and I argue about which holiday was better, she may point out that bad meal we had in the mountain hut, and I might point out the day I got sand in my bathing trunks and so on. But none of this is providing a convergent answer to a definite point out the day I got sand in my bathing trunks and so on. But none of this is providing a convergent answer to a definite problem for which there's a definite measure. And I think a lot of human life is rather like that.
Well, life is, all you're saying is life is complicated. That's true. That's why I do physics. But the statement I think that Sam's trying to get at, which I'm very sympathetic to, is that you're absolutely right. It's very difficult to determine, and there may be many equivalent solutions to a problem. But without asking, if you wanted to sit down with your wife and say which was better, you'd have to ask some questions about what happened during this and what happened during that, and make some rational assessments based on those experiences. And without doing that, you couldn't address the question at all. And I think that's the point that I was trying to emphasize. It's very complicated, and for humans, and it may be impossible to actually answer the question. Just like I don't know where every atom is in the air molecules in this room, you would argue that in principle there's a series of questions and a process by which you might try and address those questions. And I think that's what.
Yeah. And in principle, you could be mistaken. You could misremember your holiday. You could fail to know what it was actually like to be you on that holiday, and you could come away thinking, well, I love Hawaii, it's my favorite place, and your wife could rightly say, you were miserable every moment I sat next to you on the beach. And that's just, so we are not incorrigible with respect to even our own experience of the world, right. And we can be self-deceived, etc. Right. But and there's obviously distinctions that don't matter all that much, and it's not worth it to try to get the details right. But in the limit, it's very clear that we are operating in a space of possible experience that's constrained by the way the world is and the brains we currently have, and the idea that somehow we have to maintain this holding pattern of moral relativism or multiculturalism or just you all have to make it up for yourselves approach to questions, to the most important questions in human life is not intellectually honest. We don't all have to make up medical truth for ourselves. We don't all have to make up physics for ourselves, and we don't all have to make up what is actually true of the human mind for ourselves. And it's just not a. It's not a credible.
I wasn't arguing that anything's made up, that we make up anything for ourselves.
Well, you work it out for everyone working it out for themselves could be wrong. There's a background truth, and that's all I'm arguing.
Sure. Do we think that the neuroscience, rapidly developing as it is, has any will it have any power in helping us understand some of these things? I mean, you talk about flourishing, Sam, human flourishing. Can you think of any neuroscience result that speaks to increases in human flourishing?
Well, that science is truly in its infancy, so it's not.
There were a couple of questions about what does the insula do, what do mirror neurons do. That's why I'm in neuroscience at this point.
Yeah, I mean, we're beginning to. People are beginning to study well-being at the level of the brain, but people are. There really is this taboo in science, and it's a taboo you can sort of hear reinforced in this room that. It is considered somehow intellectually disreputable or Orwellian or Huxleyan to ever imagine that science can tell us, in a prescriptive sense, how we should live. But there's nothing Orwellian about science telling you, medical science saying, listen, if you don't want to die of lung cancer, don't smoke. There's no men in white lab coats don't descend on every smoker, and we just give the information out. And if you don't want to get lung cancer, well, the first thing to not do is smoke. There's no one in this room who would be indifferent to knowledge coming from science if we discovered how best to teach children compassion. I mean, surely there are wrong ways to teach children compassion. If an advanced psychology told us, listen, if you do this in the first 2 years of life, you're going to have much more compassionate children than they otherwise would be. Having some scientific understanding of the role that compassion plays in our life, who would be indifferent to that information? Who would feel that it was an Orwellian overreach on the part of psychological science to give that information out? I just don't see the problem.
Pat, do you have anything on neuroscience you want to say?
Well, I mean, a question that I think has come up in conversation with you, actually, is that as neuroscience progresses and we understand more about the various processes underlying learning, that we may be able to find increasingly good methods in addition to what we know on a behavioral level that allow us to teach better, to teach in a more comprehensive way, to have information in a way that's much more integrated. I mean, ultimately, I think this would be consistent with something that would interest Sam, is that we might find ways that allow us to make humans more rational in the ways that we go about in the behavioral level, teaching them the various things about the nature of their social world and how to flourish in that social world, how to be good citizens, how to cooperate well, and how to do well. I mean, I don't want to sound Pollyanna-ish about this because, of course, there is tremendous variability in many respects across the population, and not just in things like intelligence, but also in the capacity for sociability and in temperament. And as we discover more about the underlying physiology of, for example, temperamental differences or the degree of sociability, there may be better and better ways of teaching children or bringing them along so that they can flourish in a greater way and so they can be better citizens. So I think those things are really quite possible. At the moment, though, we really just don't know enough about the organization of the brain to do that. But things are progressing at a quite remarkable rate. And so it does seem to me, and I know that you've been involved with the education project in San Diego, but it does seem to me that we may very well be able to achieve greater things in the education process, and in particular, not just with regard to learning math and physics, wonderful though they are, but we may be able to teach better in this broader domain. And so I think those are things that we might want to take into account.
There were several questions that dealt with, I don't want to get into the details of philosophical arguments here, but there were several questions nevertheless did present what I presume is supposed to be the ultimate smackdown here, which is you can't derive an ought from an is. We've heard it lots of times. Could we just dispense with that quite quickly and somebody answer that?
Yeah.
I would love to address that.
Can I?
Sure.
No, I think there's several.
I thought I dealt with that in my talk. We can't get is without ought. I mean, science can't justify science. That doesn't make science unscientific. I mean, science can't justify our urge to understand the universe. It can't justify our respect for evidence. It can't justify our respect for logical consistency. That doesn't make it unscientific. Medicine can't justify not wanting to die early. But once you admit you don't want to die early, you can have a science of medicine. These are false problems in philosophy. And that's one of the reasons why I started denigrating philosophy. Because it's just, I mean, people are, you can't believe the email I get from very smart and overeducated people who think that that there's no way to argue against the Taliban because they've read some Hume saying you can't get an ought from an is.
You know, it's interesting about Hume. I mean, of course, Simon is the great Hume scholar here, certainly not me, but when you really pay very close attention, what he does seem to be saying is that you can't derive a statement about what ought to be from statements about is. Well, what does he mean exactly by derive? Well, if we take modern logic as our cue here, what he means is that you can't construct a valid argument where the conclusion absolutely follows given the premises. All right, so you can't derive it. So there isn't a logical, that is a deductively valid argument that will do it for you. But what about induction? What about inference to the best explanation? And there what I think is quite interesting, that when you actually read Hume, he himself makes all kinds of inferences about what we ought to do based on the fact. Now, they're not deductively valid inferences, but quite honestly, how one gets around the world most of the time has almost nothing to do with deduction and has everything to do with other kinds of pragmatic inferences. Most days I make many decisions about what I ought to do that aren't necessarily social decisions. And they are not derived using a logically valid argument. They're just inferences about what's a reasonable thing to do. If I have a terrible toothache, I ought to go to the dentist. Given the background knowledge I have, it's a perfectly reasonable thing for me to do. So we can concede Hume's point that you can't derive an ought statement from is statements. But I think all of the time within both the physical world or the physical domain and the social domain, we make judgments about what we ought to do without resorting to a yet deeper rule that tells us, that provides sort of the normative basis. And that seems to be borne out by results in psychology.
So,
I knew you'd interrupt me, Ron.
I just need to say one thing. The old line from Shakespeare about let's kill all the lawyers, it seems to be let's kill all the philosophers. I'm just looking at a piece here in Sam's book, the footnotes to chapter 1, Moral Truth. You gave two reasons why you hadn't. Many of my critics fault me for not engaging more directly with the academic literature on moral philosophy, and then you can speak to this if you want to as well. But there are two reasons why I haven't done this. First of all, I've read them. You didn't arrive at your position by doing that. You used logic and so on and so forth. And secondly, you said, I'm convinced that every appearance of terms like metaethics, deontology, non-cognitivism, anti-realism, emotivism, etc., directly increases the amount of boredom in the universe.
I stand by that.
Yeah.
So,
but you see, that's your view, Sam. I find it really exciting when people
I could
talk
be
about
wrong.
meta-ethics.
I could be wrong, but
it seems to me that there's a problem. I don't understand why. I guess I'll denigrate philosophy. Why appeal to an authority of some? Why? One of the things I like about science is that we don't appeal to anyone usually more than a year old. And when we look at the literature, we certainly don't say, well, you know, what they thought 500 years ago is really, really so significant that we need to do. Who the heck cares what Hume said? It seems to me at some level, because he was living in a world that knew a lot less than we did. Now, he raised questions that are universal and that we continue to have to ask today. But because he said, but what amazes me is the presumption that there are many examples where it's obvious that you can get ought from is. For example, let's say we determine that educating women will produce societies in the third world that have better economies, that have fewer children, that generally produce more peaceful and sustainable environments. Well, that's determining what a process is, and it obviously leads to an obvious ought. I don't see the...
You have to have the premises. I mean, I happen to share those value premises that you mentioned, but obviously not everybody does.
But Peter, why can't you do the same thing? Why can't you attack the philosophical underpinnings of medicine in the same way? Mm-hmm. If you're continually vomiting...
Share those value premises that you mentioned, but obviously not everybody does.
But Peter, why can't you do the same thing? Why can't you attack the philosophical underpinnings of medicine in the same way? Mm-hmm. If you're continually vomiting, you should go to the doctor and get X, Y, and Z. But that just assumes you don't want to continually vomit.
Yeah, it does, exactly.
What about the person who wants to continually vomit?
But that's an assumption. I mean, your example was, if I want to live longer, then I should, but not everybody does want to live longer.
But that's shorthand for a whole suite of concerns that everyone recognizes are the only intelligible discussion about human health. And now if we can find one person who says, listen, I like vomiting, I like continuous pain, and I'd like to die tomorrow, he's not offering an alternate medical, health-based worldview that we have to take seriously. He just doesn't get invited back to the conference about medicine.
But
so it could be with the conference on morality. That's all.
But look, I do spend time at conferences where we discuss the technological imperative, the fact that you now have more equipment that can prolong people's lives. Should you use it? I mean, that's an ethical question that medicine doesn't really help you to answer.
No, okay, but that's a false use of my analogy. I'm not saying medicine can answer these things. I'm saying that question of whether we should use medicine in this way is intelligible in a larger space where we talk about human well-being.
So it's intelligible, but it's not answered.
Yeah, right. Well, no, it's hard. It could be hard to answer. There are an infinite number of scientifically coherent questions that we will never answer and we can't answer. The one, my favorite, which I use all the time now, is what was JFK thinking the moment he got shot? Okay, we have no idea. But this is a well-posed question. It has an answer, and we don't know it. But we know what it wasn't. I mean, he wasn't thinking about string theory. He wasn't thinking.
You don't know that.
I know that, and I'll tell you what I do know. He wasn't thinking, I wonder if Sam Harris is going to use me as an example at this conference.
Yeah.
He wasn't.
Simon, just answer for me, if you would, Lawrence's point about his ahistorical point there. I remember a review you did of Bernard Williams's books where you talked precisely about the need for the historical perspective.
Yes, I know, it's terrible. You know, science now is being used by Lawrence in the narrow sense that he explicitly said he wasn't using it in. Namely, it's the physicists and chemists who don't read stuff that's more than a year old. And I think he's very wise. He probably shouldn't read Shakespeare or Tolstoy or Aristotle or Hume or Darwin. These are all well over a century old. And of course, they've got absolutely nothing to tell us about life. Absolutely nothing. And the reason he shouldn't read them is that you have to come to read something with a mind which is prepared to accept it. I'm sorry that Sam has come to ethics with its own vocabulary, meta-ethics, emotivism, expressivism, and so on, obviously determined to find it boring. And I'm sure he can find it boring.
No.
And many people come to Shakespeare and find it boring, and many people listen to Beethoven and find it boring. And there is no argument that will stop them, and that's part of Hume's point about reason. Bernard Williams, a great moral philosopher, once said that there's a holy grail that some people have, which is to find the argument that will stop them in their tracks when they come to take you away. Now, it's perfectly true. Hume thought there was no such argument. And I believe you can know as much science as you could ever find out, and you'll still not find the argument that will stop them in their tracks when they come to take you away. That's the point about the is-ought gap. And that's the point about not being able to derive morals from reason.
But that's a move you can't make in any other domain of knowledge. We have not found the argument that will convince a majority of the American people that evolution is a fact. Okay, 25% agree that evolution is a fact. It's been 150 years. Biology, the truth of biology is not predicated on being able to convince everyone. And so that's just a straw man argument.
I would also add, I mean, you're absolutely right in what you said, that these people are worth reading, but they're worth reading with a modern mind. You believe that you as a philosopher, you believe you have more to say about Hume because you're living in the 21st century where where human knowledge, our knowledge of the world allows you to reflect on those same ideas that he was talking about, but with a more prepared and capable mind to do it, in principle. And that's the point that I'm saying, is that we shouldn't take these words on authority. They're interesting ideas, but we've learned something, and we should be prepared to say that they're wrong, or we should be prepared to say we now know better. And I'm sure that in some sense, as a philosopher, you'd love to write a piece saying we know better than Hume, and here's the reason why.
Yeah, I mean, I don't deny that we read with more experienced minds in some ways. We've got other sources of authority. We've got other bits of
Let's
knowledge.
expand it a little bit to think about literature as you were just doing there. Let me give you an example. How many of you, does the name John Coetzee mean anything to you? J.M. Coetzee, C-O-E-T-Z-E-E, is Nobel Prize-winning
I don't pronounce it that way.
writer with one of his books was called Elizabeth Costello, one called Disgrace, recently Summertime. There's a volume out now actually called John Coetzee and Ethics, and two chapters, a book, a short novella called The Lives of Animals, which is from his novel Elizabeth Costello, was actually his presentation as some lectures at Princeton. You were a respondent, Amy Gutman was there, Wendy Doniger, and so on. Could you speak to this point, because I think it's rather an important one?
I'm sorry, what is
the question, the intersection of literature and ethics, and whether you can find anything of value about this question, the question about morality in here and so on?
Yeah, I mean, certainly I think we can. Obviously, I think Simon mentioned writers like Tolstoy or any of the Shakespeare. We can read them, and through them we can learn to understand what things are like for other people that we might not have grasped. That's obviously valuable. Coetzee, I think, does that. I think what's distinctive about many of his novels is that they pose deep moral questions for us, and that they present sometimes quite explicitly, as in Elizabeth Costello when she's talking about animals and the suffering that we wrongly inflict on animals, sometimes more implicitly in terms of building the context of the situation, as in Disgrace, for example. We are led to think about these questions in a particular context, and I think that is clearly enlightening. Now, I don't think, if we are taking science in this very wide sense, I don't think it's contrary to what Sam would be suggesting. It's a way of gaining insight, and perhaps it doesn't test it in a rigorous way, but it provides insights which we might want to explore further on.
Yeah, I wanted then to weave that also, and we're coming to a close now, to Steve, because in Steve's presentation today, where you were actually talking about the escalator of reason, you were talking about things improving, you were talking about the decline of violence, one of the things that you suggested as a factor in there was, in fact, the prevalence and the increase of novels and so on, being able to put yourself in somebody else's mental shoes and so on. So could you elaborate a little bit on that?
Yeah, there is when you ask what are the developments that led to the measurable moral progress that our civilization has enjoyed, such as the abolition of slavery and torture and cruelty to animals, one could make the case that an increase in literacy, including the consumption of realistic fiction, played a role. What many novelists do is what many moral philosophers do, that is, come up with a thought experiment, a hypothetical scenario, sometimes preposterous, that clarifies moral intuitions. And I think a lot of fiction does that for us, more artfully perhaps than, although maybe less precisely than the typical philosophical thought experiment. I mean, just one example is the sequence in Huckleberry Finn, in which Huck is racked with guilt over the terrible thing that's been paining his conscience, namely that he ran away with a slave who was someone else's property. And what did that slave owner ever do to poor Huck that he would be so treacherous as to steal his slave? And then finally Huck says, "Oh, well, I guess I'm a morally imperfect person. I'm not gonna turn Jim in." Now that's a wonderful way of tweaking our intuitions as to whether moral conviction necessarily leads to morally praiseworthy conclusions. So one way, that's just one of many examples, I think, in great fiction that pushes our moral intuitions via thought experiments. And another is that fiction is an empathy technology. In order to enjoy fiction, you have to project yourself into the life of someone who may be very much unlike you. The rise of the novel in the 18th century did come before the rise of many humanitarian reforms. one can point to specific acts of works of fiction that plausibly led to an expansion of concern. Maybe the most famous example was Uncle Tom's Cabin, which, at least according to legend, when Lincoln met Harriet Beecher Stowe, he said, "So you're the little lady that started this big war." And there are many other examples in which consciousness of the suffering of a forgotten class of people, or indeed animals, came from reading first-person accounts of what it's like to be that person or that animal. This is all anecdotal and plausible, but there are experiments initiated by Daniel Batson and others where if you bring someone in the lab and have them take the viewpoint of someone when you read their words, you do become measurably more sympathetic to the author of those words and to people in the same class, say AIDS victims or drug addicts. So it's a little bit of experimental support behind the somewhat sentimental notion that reading fiction genuinely is morally uplifting.
I want to just jump in here, partly because we're paying for it, but you all received this notice about science and culture, an Origins event that's a 4-day event celebrating science and culture in April. And one of the reasons we're involved, I want to come back in some sense to say that, to me at least, one of the things that makes science so worthwhile is not that it produces technology, but it resembles art, literature, drama, all of which have value by forcing us to reassess our place in the cosmos. That's why we like great literature. It forces us to see the world a new way. To me, and to many of us, that's the value of science, is it does the same thing. And so bringing them together is a natural thing, and that's one of the reasons why we're going to celebrate it in April. That's all I want to say.
That's good. And I mean, just going back to Bronowski for you, in The Ascent of Man, when he's at the pool at Auschwitz, he's talking about science, and he says that science is a very human form of knowledge. We're always at the brink of the known. We always feel forward for what is to be hoped. Every judgment in science stands on the edge of error and is personal. Science is a tribute to what we can know, although we are fallible. In the end, the words were said by Oliver Cromwell, "I beseech you in the bowels of Christ, think it possible you may be mistaken." So, your final vote. Can science tell us right from wrong? Those who say yes. And those who say no?
I think you changed some minds.
I think that's a healthy, flourishing situation to be in. Thank you all for being here.
Thank you, Roger.